third phase of the Revolutionary War and the end to the Revolutionary War. So when the British surrendered at Yorktown, which is where we ended with on the last PowerPoint, this is actually going to end the major fighting in North America. Though keep in mind, once again, it's not like the Americans knew that at the time. And actually, George Washington in particular was really distrustful of that. Is this going to end everything? Still, there's going to be skirmishes for another year. The thing is, in March of 1782, Lord North, the Prime Minister of England, is going to resign. And the new Prime Minister is going to be Lord Rockingham. And when he becomes Prime Minister, it is with the instructions to make peace with the American colonies. He is going to do so, though actually I should point out he dies, and it ends up being Lord Shelburne, the next Prime Minister, that's actually present for the peace negotiation. So this is going to be a lengthy peace negotiation. Americans wanted independence, but they also wanted, they actually wanted territorial concessions like all of Canada. They also wanted access to the British-controlled fishing grounds in the North Atlantic. However, American negotiators were concerned that the French and the Spanish might strike some sort of deal or bargain with the British at the expense of the United States. So it's really important is just make peace pretty quickly, and more than anything else, restore the Anglo-American commercial ties to Great Britain. Because keep in mind, up until this point, a lot of the American colonies' economy had depended on trade with Great Britain. So we want to reestablish that. America will officially sign the Treaty of Paris on September 3rd of 1783. Keep in mind, if you Google search Treaty of Paris, there's a million of them, so make sure you got that date down. The United States is going to basically get everything but Canada. You can see that on that map to the far right, that the United States does not gain Canada. Great Britain will also have to acknowledge that the United States was free, sovereign, and independent. Now, Spain is actually going to acquire the provinces of East and West Florida. When I say West Florida, imagine the panhandle and that panhandle extending all the way across, so you can see that. And you can see there's that area that's claimed both by the United States and Spain there in that far right map. The United States, this means does not have access to the Gulf of Mexico. On top of that, the treaty is going to require the British forces that are on American soil to leave, and also to leave behind any American-owned property, including those who had been formerly enslaved. The other part of this is going to declare the debts between the citizens of Great Britain and the United States are still valid. Basically, remember, a lot of Americans had bought certain items on British credit, so they still owe Great Britain. And then Congress was also in turn supposed to recommend that the states restore the rights and property taken from loyalists during the war. So war is over. On December of 1783, the last British troops would leave New York, and they actually did take about 3,000 African Americans with them, many of them who had been previously enslaved. So they didn't quite follow some of those rules. We're going to see some issues with this later on. The Continental Army is going to officially disband in the summer of 1783, and in December of that year, Washington will say farewell, resign his commission to Congress, and he goes home to Mount Vernon. When you're looking at the entirety of the Revolutionary War, there's three really big things to keep in mind. Washington and just leadership overall during the war was extremely important to victory. But I say Washington himself because he understood, the power of the Continental Army and how that could help win the war and, gain support, such as the second thing that was extremely important for victory was the French being the American allies, not just for economic and military reasons, but also you have to think about that legitimizes the United States as a country. And then, of course, the British themselves actually contributed to their own downfall. They had made many mistakes during this war. including, bureaucratic inefficiency, but also, the hesitant command near the early stages of the war, and then their overconfidence later on. We have to keep in mind, too, that the American people have gone through now 8 years of warfare, and they're going to be affected by this Revolutionary War. Military service had wrenched families apart. Sporadic raids had literally brought the war to people's backyards. And then, of course, there's a lot of economic disruptions. Women had been affected when their husbands, sons, brothers, fiancés, uncles, so on and so forth, had all gone off to fight in the war, and many had died. The extended absence of men in their life actually would increase women's burdens and enlarge their responsibilities. They actually assumed a lot of new public roles during the conflict, and this is a trend that we see in American history over and over and over again, especially if you when you take 1302, you'll see this happen. Even though with this, for a lot of women, it never occurred to them to assume these traditional male roles on a permanent basis. Even when you have like Abigail Adams has her whole remember the ladies, she wasn't expecting equal political rights. It was more about, having some sort of legal protection for women and, recognizing women's value and everything. When it comes to how the war affects African Americans in the North, we actually see the war helps bring about the end of slavery, though it does remain legal there for some time. Part of this is with the whole all men are created equal and the fight for freedom. This idea is not really cohesive with that of enslaving people. However, in the South, slavery was, the enslavement of people was integral to the economy, and white planters are going to view it as crucial to post-war recovery. And so ultimately, the Revolutionary War will actually strengthen the institution of enslaving people, and specifically enslaving African Americans during, especially in areas like the Carolinas and Georgia. We do see some people who had formerly been enslaved who fled with the British go on to live in the West Indies or Canada, and actually some would even go all the way back to Africa and establish the colony of Sierra Leone. And then we have our Native Americans. The thing is, unlike African Americans who had fled to the British side during the Revolutionary War, Native Americans couldn't just leave with the British at the end of this. The peace treaty of 1783, Great Britain basically surrendered all of its territory east of the Mississippi River. And this shocks and infuriates the Native Americans who had lived there, because they had not surrendered. And in fact, no Native American had been present at these peace negotiations in Paris. So this is a disaster for the Native Americans, because now they have to deal with a torrent of white settlers encroaching on their land. And last but not least, we have to keep in mind the economic disruption that came about with this war. There's all kinds of problems with money, partly due to this war. There's issues with a lot of paper money was printed in the United States, and this led to rampant inflation. Although it should be pointed out that the fact that the American side was successful, and the fact that there's a relatively stable peace after the Revolutionary War, it's just that basically the American people generally were able to cope despite this economic disruption.